The village of St. Mary Mead had dressed itself in its finest for the annual summer fete, held in the grounds of the old rectory where bunting fluttered between ancient elm trees and the scent of honeysuckle mingled with the more practical aromas of Victoria sponge and cucumber sandwiches. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly in the dappled shade near the prize-winning rose border, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be a christening shawl. To any casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in her handiwork, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the social tapestry unfolding across the sun-warmed lawn. The afternoon had begun with the usual pleasant chaos of village life. Mrs. Dolly Bantry held court near the White Elephant stall, her voice carrying across the grass as she regaled anyone within earshot about her recent triumph with the delphiniums. The vicar, dear Reverend Clement, moved between the various attractions with the determined cheerfulness of a man who knew his duty and intended to perform it thoroughly, while Dr. Haydock examined the vegetable displays with the same careful attention he brought to his patients. What had caught Miss Marple's particular interest, however, was the stranger who moved among the familiar faces with such practiced ease. Mr. Giles Asherton had arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 days prior, taking rooms at the Blue Boar and introducing himself as a writer researching English rural customs. He was a man of perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair and the kind of refined features that spoke of good breeding, though his clothes, while well cut, showed the subtle signs of careful maintenance that suggested reduced circumstances. There was something about Mr. Asherton that didn't quite ring true, though Miss Marple would have been hard-pressed to articulate exactly what troubled her. His hands were too soft for a man who claimed to have spent years traveling in primitive conditions. His knowledge of literature, when tested in casual conversation by the schoolmaster, had proved surprisingly shallow. Most curious of all was his habit of positioning himself always with his back to the strongest light, as though he preferred his features to remain somewhat indistinct. Such a charming gentleman, Mrs. Weatherby had confided to Miss Marple earlier, her cheeks flushed with what might have been the heat or something more personal. So well-traveled and cultured, he's been telling me the most fascinating stories about his research in remote villages. Miss Marple had murmured something appropriately encouraging while noting that Mrs. Weatherby, a widow of comfortable means and romantic disposition, seemed quite taken with her mysterious guest. It was a situation that had played out countless times in villages across England, though it didn't always end as the hopeful lady imagined. The afternoon progressed with its familiar rhythms. Young Timmy Fletcher, the postman's son, had been entertaining himself by running about the grounds, weaving between the various stalls and attractions with the boundless energy of childhood. It was Timmy who first made the observation that would later prove so significant. "Look, Miss Marple," he called out, pointing across the lawn to where Mr. Asherton stood conversing with Mrs. Weatherby near the sundial. "The writing gentleman hasn't got a proper shadow." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with mild interest. It was true that where Mr. Asherton stood, the dappled shade from the elm's leaves fell in such a way as to break up his outline, making him appear almost insubstantial in the shifting light. "Everyone has a shadow, dear," she replied gently. "Sometimes we simply can't see it clearly." But the child's innocent observation seemed to crystallize something that had been troubling her about their visitor. There was indeed something insubstantial about Mr. Giles Asherton, as though he were a man without a past, without connections, without the accumulated weight of lived experience that gave others their metaphorical shadows. The crisis began, as such things often do, with something quite ordinary. Mrs. Weatherby had been helping to serve refreshments at the tea tent, her movements animated by the pleasure of having such a distinguished guest to attend to. Miss Marple watched as she poured lemonade into 2 glasses, offering one to Mr. Asherton with a smile that was perhaps a shade too bright. There was a moment of confusion, a wasp, perhaps, or simply the natural clumsiness that comes with trying too hard to impress, and the glasses were briefly set down together on the white cloth. Mr. Asherton, with the smooth gallantry that seemed to characterize all his interactions, reached for what he assumed was his glass. But in that moment of reaching, Miss Marple observed something curious. A barely perceptible hesitation, the slightest touch of his fingertips to the rim of one glass before selecting the other. It was such a small thing that anyone else would have dismissed it as meaningless, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that it was often the smallest gestures that revealed the most about human nature. Mrs. Weatherby lifted her glass with evident pleasure, chatting gaily about the success of the fete and the beautiful weather. Mr. Asherton responded with his usual polished charm, though Miss Marple noticed that his attention seemed somewhat divided, his gaze occasionally drifting to his companion's face with an intensity that might have been concern or calculation. It was perhaps 10 minutes later when Mrs. Weatherby excused herself, saying she felt rather warm and thought she might sit quietly in the shade for a moment. Miss Marple watched her settle onto a bench beneath the old apple tree, her movements already showing a curious languidness that seemed out of keeping with her earlier animation. The scream, when it came, belonged to young Sally Brent, the baker's daughter, who had gone to ask Mrs. Weatherby about the arrangements for clearing the tea things. It was a sound that cut through the gentle murmur of village conversation like a blade, sharp with shock and growing terror. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate calm and rose from her chair. There was no need to hurry. The damage, whatever it was, had already been done. She made her way across the lawn with her usual measured pace, noting how the crowd formed and reformed around the bench like water around a stone. Dr. Haydock was already there, his professional manner masking what Miss Marple suspected was considerable alarm. Mrs. Weatherby sat exactly as she had been, her hands folded peacefully in her lap, her face turned slightly upward as though she had been watching the play of light through the apple leaves. But there was a terrible stillness about her, and her eyes, which had been so bright with pleasure only minutes before, now stared sightlessly at nothing at all. "She's gone," Dr. Haydock said quietly to the vicar, who had pushed through the gathering crowd. "We must move people away. This is no sight for the children." Miss Marple remained where she was, a small, neat figure on the periphery of the gathering storm. Her gaze moved thoughtfully from the empty lemonade glass that still sat on the tea table to Mr. Asherton, who stood at what might be considered a respectful distance, his face composed in an expression of appropriate concern. He had positioned himself, she noted, with his back to the afternoon sun, so that his features remained somewhat indistinct in the shadow he cast. The guest who had brought no shadow, Miss Marple reflected, had certainly left a very dark one behind. As the peaceful afternoon dissolved into questions and accusations, as neighbors looked at each other with new suspicion and the comfortable rhythms of village life shattered like glass, she began to consider the curious mathematics of human nature that could transform lemonade and sunshine into something so much darker. The first thread of the mystery had been drawn taut, and Miss Marple, with the patient attention of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the small betrayals and large deceptions that lay beneath the surface of ordinary life, prepared to follow it wherever it might lead. The immediate aftermath of Mrs. Weatherby's collapse transformed the gentle garden party into something far more sinister. Dr. Haydock, his professional demeanor masking considerable alarm, gently closed the poor woman's eyes while issuing firm instructions that nothing at the tea table should be disturbed. The vicar, recognizing the gravity of the situation, hurried to telephone for proper authorities, leaving the gathered villagers to grapple with the impossible reality that death had visited their peaceful celebration. Miss Marple remained where she was, a quiet observer as the crowd began to disperse under Dr. Haydock's direction. Her sharp eyes noted how the white bunting, so festive moments before, now seemed almost indecently bright against the sudden hush that had fallen over the grounds. More importantly, she observed the small but telling details others might miss. The damp circle on the cloth where a second glass had recently stood, the minute indentation on the sugar tongs where an eager hand had pressed too firmly. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the gathering like ripples on a pond. Mrs. Bantry, her voice pitched higher than usual with nervous energy, declared it must have been poor Millicent's heart, the excitement, the heat, the strain of organizing everything, but others were already casting glances toward Mr. Asherton, who stood at what might be considered a respectful distance, his expression composed in lines of appropriate concern. "Did you see how particular he was about the glasses?" Mrs. Price Ridley murmured to anyone within earshot. "Seemed to know exactly which one to take, if you ask me." Young Timmy Fletcher, who had been shooed away from the immediate scene by his mother, approached Miss Marple with the eager confidence of a child who had witnessed something important. "I saw it all, Miss Marple," he whispered, his eyes bright with the gravity of the moment. "The writing gentleman was ever so careful about which glass he picked up. They got mixed about, see, and he touched one before taking the other." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle clicking as she processed this crucial piece of testimony. "And Mrs. Weatherby's glass, dear, what happened to that?" "She drank from it right away, said how refreshing it was. But then she went all queer-like, sleepy and strange." The boy's voice dropped to an even more confidential whisper. "And I still say he hasn't got a proper shadow, that one." The arrival of Constable Polk, pink-faced and solemn from his hurried bicycle ride, brought a semblance of official order to the proceedings. He produced his notebook with considerable dignity and began taking names and statements, though his usual duties rarely extended beyond lost dogs and minor disturbances. The gravity of the situation was not lost on him, and he approached his task with the careful attention of a man who knew he was out of his depth, but determined to do his duty properly. Mr. Asherton, when questioned, responded with his characteristic polish, confirming that yes, he had been present when the refreshments were served, and yes, he had spoken with Mrs. Weatherby shortly before her collapse. His answers were perfectly reasonable, delivered in that cultured voice that had so impressed the ladies of St. Mary Mead. Yet Miss Marple noticed how he positioned himself during the questioning, always with his back to the strongest light, always maintaining that curious insubstantiality that young Timmy had observed. Dr. Haydock's examination, conducted with professional thoroughness, revealed what he carefully described as suspicious circumstances, requiring further investigation. His reluctance to be more specific only fueled the growing speculation among the villagers, who found themselves looking at their charming visitor with new and uncomfortable eyes. The transformation in the villagers' attitude toward Mr. Asherton was swift and merciless. Where once there had been admiring glances and eager invitations, now there were suspicious whispers and meaningful looks. The man who had arrived 3 days ago as a welcome addition to their small society was rapidly becoming its chief suspect, isolated by the very charm that had initially endeared him to them. Miss Marple observed it all with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed such transformations before. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent in its patterns, whether the setting was a peaceful English village or the pages of the novels she so enjoyed. The question now was not whether Mr. Asherton was guilty of something. His behavior suggested secrets, certainly, but whether those secrets included the murder of poor Mrs. Weatherby. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the disrupted fate began its melancholy dissolution, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious mathematics of suspicion and how quickly the absence of a shadow could become the presence of guilt. The evening that followed Mrs. Weatherby's death settled over St. Mary Mead like a heavy blanket, muffling the usual cheerful sounds of village life. Miss Marple, having tidied away the remnants of her disrupted knitting, found herself drawn repeatedly to her sitting-room window, watching the subtle changes in her neighbor's behavior as word of the tragedy spread from house to house. The Blue Boar, where Mr. Asherton had taken rooms, seemed to exert a peculiar fascination for passers-by, though none lingered long enough to appear overtly curious. It was well past 8 o'clock when young Timmy Fletcher appeared at her door, his face flushed with excitement and something that might have been fear. Behind him stood his mother, Mrs. Fletcher, wringing her hands with obvious distress. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," Mrs. Fletcher began, her voice tight with anxiety, "but Timmy here has been going on about something he saw yesterday evening, and I thought perhaps you might know what to make of it. He won't rest until he's told someone who'll listen properly." Miss Marple settled them in her comfortable sitting room, and Timmy, perched on the edge of his chair, launched into his revelation with the gravity children reserve for truly significant secrets. "It's about the writing gentleman, Miss Marple. Yesterday evening, just as it was getting dark, I saw him walking past our cottage. I was up in my room and I happened to look out." The boy's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "He wasn't alone. There was a lady with him, and they were talking very quietly, like they didn't want to be overheard." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm. "Did you recognize the lady, dear?" "That's just it, Miss Marple. It looked like Mrs. Weatherby, but she seemed different somehow. She was wearing a dark coat I'd never seen before, and her hair was done up differently. They seemed to be having some sort of argument. Not loud, but you could tell by the way they stood, the way she kept shaking her head." Mrs. Fletcher leaned forward anxiously. "The boy's been having nightmares about it, Miss Marple. He keeps saying he doesn't understand how Mrs. Weatherby could have been meeting with that gentleman when she barely seemed to know him at the feet." After the Fletchers departed, Miss Marple sat quietly, considering this new information. If Mrs. Weatherby had indeed met secretly with Mr. Asherton the evening before the fete, it suggested a prior acquaintance that neither had acknowledged publicly. The woman who had served tea with such apparent pleasure at meeting her charming guest had perhaps been playing a role, concealing a relationship that was far more complex than it appeared. The morning brought Inspector Slack from Much Benham, a compact, efficient man who wasted little time on pleasantries. Constable Polk, relieved but slightly deflated, deferred to the inspector's brisk authority as the rectory grounds were transformed into an official crime scene. Dr. Haydock's preliminary findings, delivered with professional gravity, confirmed what many had already suspected. Mrs. Weatherby had died from what appeared to be a fast-acting poison, though further analysis would be required for certainty. This official pronouncement served only to intensify the village's growing suspicions. The quiet murmurs of the previous evening had blossomed into a full chorus of conjecture. Mrs. Bantry, now fully recovered from her initial shock, held court at the village shop, declaring with conviction that it's always the charming ones you have to watch. All that polish hiding something nasty underneath. Miss Marple, when called upon to provide her statement, recounted her observations with characteristic precision. She described the serving of the lemonade, the brief confusion over the glasses, and Mr. Asherton's subtle hesitation in selecting which one to take. She also mentioned, as if it were merely a child's fancy, young Timmy's observation about shadows and his account of the evening meeting. It was during this interview that Miss Marple made her own crucial observation. While Inspector Slack examined the tea service, now carefully preserved as evidence, she noticed something that had escaped everyone else's attention. The silver sugar tongs, gleaming innocently among the other implements, bore the faintest indentation on one arm, the kind of mark that might be made by pressing too firmly or by someone unfamiliar with their proper use. "Mrs. Weatherby never took sugar," Miss Marple mentioned quietly to Inspector Slack. "She was quite particular about it, watching her figure, you know." The inspector's sharp gaze fixed on the tongs with new interest. If Mrs. Weatherby never used sugar, why had someone handled the tongs with such force? It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that murder often revealed itself through the smallest inconsistencies in human behavior. As the morning progressed and the official investigation gained momentum, the transformation in the village's attitude toward Mr. Asherton became complete. The man who had arrived as a welcome novelty had become a pariah, his very composure now interpreted as suspicious rather than admirable. When he ventured out for his morning walk, no one greeted him, no one met his eye. The guest who had brought no shadow had indeed cast a very dark one over St. Mary Mead, though whether it was the shadow of guilt or merely suspicion remained to be seen. Miss Marple, watching from her window as the drama unfolded, reflected on the curious nature of truth and how often the most obvious explanation proved to be merely the most convenient. The bent sugar tongs and Timmy's testimony painted a picture far more complex than a simple case of a charming stranger poisoning a lonely widow. The question now was whether Inspector Slack would see beyond the village's ready-made suspect to the deeper currents of deception that Miss Marple sensed flowing beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward crime. Inspector Slack chose the Blue Boar's small private parlor for his formal interview with Mr. Asherton, and Mrs. Crump, the landlady, bustled about with nervous efficiency, providing tea and biscuits as though proper hospitality might somehow restore normalcy to her establishment. Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to return a borrowed novel to Mrs. Crump, found herself discreetly positioned in an adjacent alcove where the conversation carried clearly through the thin partition. Mr. Asherton's responses were models of cultured composure. Yes, he had taken refreshment at the fete. No, he had noticed nothing unusual in Mrs. Weatherby's behavior. His voice maintained that same polished quality that had so impressed the village ladies, though Miss Marple detected the faintest strain beneath the surface, like a violin string wound just slightly too tight. When Inspector Slack pressed him about young Timmy's account of the evening meeting, however, something shifted almost imperceptibly in Mr. Asherton's manner. "Children possess vivid imaginations, Inspector," he replied smoothly. "I took a constitutional walk, certainly, but encountered no one beyond a casual greeting to a passer-by near the churchyard hedge. Twilight can be most deceptive." The subsequent search of his rooms revealed little beyond the ordinary possessions of a traveling gentleman of modest means. Miss Marple, invited by Mrs. Crump's anxious courtesy to view the aftermath, noted the careful darning on his shirts, the well-maintained but aging leather of his traveling case. What caught her attention more particularly was a small indentation in the drawer lining where something rectangular had recently been removed, and the faint medicinal scent that lingered despite the room's general tidiness. It was later that morning, while helping to restore order to the rectory kitchen, that Miss Marple made her most significant discovery. Sally Brent, the baker's daughter who had first discovered Mrs. Weatherby's body, was industriously polishing the recovered tea service under the watchful eye of the vicar's wife. "Such a to-do over a wasp," Sally was saying, her voice still shaky from the morning's events. "But I couldn't have it buzzing about the lemonade, could I? Made such a confusion with the glasses and all." Miss Marple examined the silver sugar tongs with careful attention. They bore a curious indentation on one arm, as though gripped with unusual force around something narrow and hard. "These are lovely pieces, dear. Part of the rectory service." "Oh, no, Miss Marple. We hadn't sufficient tongs for the extra refreshment table, so Mrs. Price Ridley suggested I fetch some from the jumble collection in the vestry. These were wrapped in tissue paper, quite forgotten they were. I gave them a quick wash and set them out with the sugar bowl." The significance was not lost on Miss Marple. Tongs borrowed at the last moment, handled by someone unfamiliar with their proper use, positioned beside refreshments that Mrs. Weatherby was known never to touch. Yet someone had used them with sufficient force to leave permanent marks, and the timing of that wasp's appearance had created precisely the confusion needed to switch glasses unobserved. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Price Ridley, who appeared in a state of considerable agitation. After the usual pleasantries, the elderly woman leaned forward conspiratorially. "Miss Marple, I simply must share something that's been troubling me dreadfully. Poor Millicent had been corresponding with me for months about some genealogical research. Her late husband's family connections. She'd become quite excited about something she'd discovered, said it would set certain people back on their heels when it came to light. This revelation cast Mrs. Weatherby's behavior in an entirely new perspective. The woman who had seemed so eager for Mr. Asherton's company might have had investigative rather than romantic motives. She mentioned arranging to meet someone who could confirm her suspicions," Mrs. Price Ridley continued. That was just 2 days ago, the very evening that Fletcher boy claims to have seen her with a writing gentleman. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple observed the village's collective sigh of relief as Inspector Slack's investigation appeared to reach its logical conclusion. Mr. Asherton, the obvious outsider, the convenient suspect whose very charm now seemed sinister in retrospect. The community's eagerness to accept this solution troubled her deeply. In her experience, when human nature provided such a tidy answer, it was often because the real truth lay buried beneath layers of more comfortable deception. The guest who had brought no shadow was indeed casting a dark one over St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple suspected that shadow belonged not to guilt, but to the village's desperate need for a simple explanation to a far more complex crime. The morning following Mrs. Weatherby's death brought Inspector Slack's methodical efficiency to St. Mary Mead, along with the uncomfortable realization that the village's eager acceptance of Mr. Asherton's guilt might be premature. Miss Marple, observing the inspector's growing confidence in his obvious suspect, suggested with her characteristic diffidence that perhaps a thorough examination of Mrs. Weatherby's papers might prove illuminating before any dramatic conclusions were drawn. "Quite right, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack replied, though his tone carried the patient condescension of a professional humoring an elderly amateur. "Constable Pork can accompany you to the cottage. Purely for form's sake, you understand." The Weatherby cottage on Church Lane presented the neat, orderly appearance of a woman who had lived methodically and alone. Edith Stone, Mrs. Weatherby's companion housekeeper, received them with the composed efficiency of someone accustomed to managing domestic crises. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with the quiet competence that made her invaluable to elderly employers and nearly invisible to everyone else. Mrs. Weatherby was most particular about her correspondence, Edith explained, leading them to the small study where a mahogany writing desk dominated one corner. She kept everything filed according to her own system, though I confess I never quite understood her passion for family histories. Miss Marple's examination of the desk revealed the extent of Mrs. Weatherby's recent preoccupation. Neat bundles of correspondence were tied with ribbon, and a leather-bound notebook contained methodical entries in Mrs. Weatherby's careful script. What immediately caught Miss Marple's attention was a subtle but significant detail. While Mrs. Weatherby spelled her own name with an E, Weatherby, her research concerned a family spelled Weatherby with an A. The distinction might seem trivial to most observers, but Miss Marple had learned that such small differences often concealed large deceptions. Among the papers, she discovered draft fragments of what appeared to be a carefully worded letter. "My dear Mr. Asherton, your response to my inquiry regarding the Weatherby family connections has been most illuminating. I believe we should meet to discuss the implications of what I have discovered, particularly as they touch upon certain claims that may prove rather embarrassing to—" The letter broke off there, but its implications were clear. Mrs. Weatherby had been investigating not merely genealogical curiosities, but matters of identity and possibly inheritance that someone had found threatening enough to kill for. "Edith, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "did your mistress go out the evening before the fete? Young Timmy Fletcher believes he saw her walking with a gentleman near the churchyard." Edith's response was immediate and certain. "Oh no, Miss Marple. Mrs. Weatherby's ankle was troubling her that evening. She sat with her knitting after supper, and we had cocoa together at 9:30. I helped her to bed myself and latched all the doors. She most certainly did not leave the house." This contradiction struck Miss Marple as highly significant. Either Timmy had been mistaken about what he had seen, or someone else had been abroad that evening, deliberately disguised to resemble Mrs. Weatherby. The implications of such deception suggested a level of premeditation that cast the crime in an entirely different light. Continuing her careful examination, Miss Marple noted several telling details that spoke of recent disturbance. A rectangular gap in the dust on a bookshelf indicated where a framed photograph had recently stood, and an album lay open, with one page neatly excised with a sharp blade. The precision of the removal suggested someone familiar with the house's contents, someone who knew exactly what they sought. Most significantly, a faint medicinal scent lingered about the desk, the same subtle odor she had detected in Mr. Asherton's room at the Blue Boar. It was not the harsh smell of common disinfectant, but something more specific, more chemical in nature. Miss Marple's excellent memory associated it with a particular type of preparation, though she could not yet place it precisely. "Has anything been disturbed here since yesterday?" she inquired mildly. Edith colored slightly. "I discovered the scullery window unlatched this morning, though I was certain I had secured it. There were crumbs on the sill, and I thought perhaps a stray cat had somehow managed the latch." "Cats," Miss Marple observed with gentle humor, "rarely carry penknives for removing photographs from albums." As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a detail on the mantelpiece that had initially escaped notice. Among Mrs. Weatherby's family photographs stood a small silver frame containing what appeared to be a very old wedding photograph, its sepia tones suggesting considerable age. The bride's features were partially obscured by her veil, but the groom bore a striking resemblance to their current suspect, though the photograph was clearly decades old. The walk back through the village provided Miss Marple with time to consider the curious mathematics of identity and inheritance that seemed to lie at the heart of this crime. The guest who had brought no shadow was beginning to acquire a very substantial past, though whether that past included murder or merely the kind of deception that made murder seem necessary remained to be determined. The pattern emerging from her discoveries suggested something far more complex than a charming stranger poisoning a lonely widow. Mrs. Weatherby had died not for romantic reasons, but because her genealogical research had uncovered secrets that someone was prepared to kill to protect. The borrowed sugar tongs, the switched glasses, the missing photograph, and the carefully planned confusion all spoke of premeditation and intimate knowledge of both the victim and the village's routines. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the village's eager acceptance of the obvious explanation. Human nature, she had observed, preferred simple solutions to complex problems, even when those solutions required ignoring inconvenient contradictions. The question now was not whether Mr. Asherton was hiding something. His behavior made that abundantly clear, but whether his secrets included murder, or whether they had simply made him a convenient scapegoat for someone whose guilt lay buried much deeper in the tangled roots of village life. The investigation was about to take a very different direction indeed, though Miss Marple suspected that the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove far more shocking than anything the village had yet imagined. The discovery at Mrs. Weatherby's cottage had left Miss Marple with more questions than answers, and she found herself drawn to seek clarification on the medical aspects of the case. Dr. Haydock, when she called upon him under the pretext of inquiring about a neighbor's health, received her with the resigned good humor of someone who recognized her true purpose. "You want to know what killed Millicent Weatherby?" he said without preamble, closing his surgery door. "I can tell you this much. It was no natural collapse. The symptoms suggest an alkaloid, something that depresses the nervous system rather than excites it. The onset was rapid, breathing became labored, and there was a particular dryness about the mouth. Whatever it was would have had a bitter taste that the lemonade's sweetness could easily have masked." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed this information. "And the preparation of such a substance, Doctor, would it require particular knowledge?" "Indeed it would. The dosage must be precise. Too little and the victim recovers. Too much and the symptoms become obvious too quickly. Whoever administered this knew exactly what they were about, including Mrs. Weatherby's approximate weight and constitution." Dr. Haydock paused thoughtfully. There was also something curious about the glass itself, a slight tackiness around the rim, as though something had been applied and allowed to dry. This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. The careful preparation suggested not impulse, but deliberate planning, and the intimate knowledge required pointed away from their obvious suspect towards someone with much closer ties to the victim. Her contemplation was interrupted that evening by an unexpected visitor. Mr. Asherton appeared at her garden gate just as twilight was settling over St. Mary Mead, his usual composed manner showing distinct signs of strain. He positioned himself carefully in the shadow of her hedge, a habit she'd observed before. "Miss Marple, I find myself in a most difficult position," he began, his cultured voice carrying an undertone of desperation. "I believe I must tell someone the truth, and you seem the most likely to understand the complexities of human nature." Miss Marple invited him to continue, noting how he remained standing where the evening shadows would obscure his features from any passing observer. "I am not the man I've represented myself to be," he confessed. "My name is indeed Giles Asherton, but I have reason to believe I'm also Giles Weatherby, the legitimate heir to properties that have been administered by others for decades. My mother was Margaret Asherton, who married James Weatherby in a private ceremony many years ago. She died when I was quite young, but among her effects was evidence of this marriage and my legitimate claim to the Weatherby estate." The implications were staggering. Miss Marple's research into Mrs. Weatherby's genealogical work suddenly took on new meaning. And Mrs. Weatherby had discovered this connection. Someone had contacted me months ago, claiming to have proof of my legitimacy. The correspondence was signed only M.W. and came from this village. I was instructed to come here and await further contact. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The evening before the fete, I met with a woman near the churchyard. She wore a dark coat and kept to the shadows, but she had Mrs. Weatherby's height and general appearance. Her voice, though, there was something different about it, a certain dryness. Miss Marple's needles paused. "Did you notice anything else about this woman?" "Her scent was distinctive. Not perfume, but something clean and medicinal. Carbolic soap, I think, and lavender. It reminded me of the nurses from my childhood." He hesitated. She examined the documents I had brought, but said the exchange would take place at the fete, where we could meet more naturally. I was to identify myself by wearing a particular flower in my lapel. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind. The medicinal scent, the intimate knowledge of village routines, the access to Mrs. Weatherby's house and papers, all pointed toward someone whose presence was so familiar as to be nearly invisible. "Mr. Asherton," she said gently, "have you noticed anything missing from your rooms at the Blue Boar?" His face darkened. "My rooms were searched, professionally, leaving no obvious signs. But certain items are gone. The original documents proving my mother's marriage and a small medicine case containing glass ampoules prescribed for a heart condition I developed after a fever years ago." Miss Marple's sharp mind immediately grasped the significance. Glass ampoules that could be broken and their contents extracted, leaving no trace of their original container. The missing sugar tongs with their mysterious indentations suddenly made perfect sense. As Mr. Asherton departed, still keeping to the shadows that had become his refuge, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of identity and inheritance. The guest who had brought no shadow was indeed hiding his true self, but his deception appeared to be one of necessity rather than malice. The real question was who had been using his legitimate claim as cover for murder, and why Mrs. Weatherby had to die to protect secrets that someone was willing to kill to preserve. The village's eagerness to blame the obvious outsider was providing perfect cover for a killer who moved among them with the invisibility of complete familiarity. Miss Marple suspected that the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove that the most dangerous shadows were cast not by mysterious strangers, but by those whose presence was so constant as to be overlooked entirely. The borrowed sugar tongs, the switched glasses, the perfectly timed confusion, all spoke of someone who knew the fate's organization intimately, who could predict every detail of the afternoon's arrangements. Someone who smelled of carbolic and lavender, who had access to Mrs. Weatherby's house and papers, and who possessed the medical knowledge necessary to prepare a precise and deadly dose. The investigation was about to take a very different direction indeed, though Miss Marple suspected that the villagers' relief at having found their scapegoat would make the truth all the more shocking when it was finally revealed. The morning following Mr. Asherton's confession found Miss Marple contemplating the curious mathematics of deception while tending to her roses. The guest who had brought no shadow was indeed hiding his true identity, but his secrets appeared to be those of inheritance rather than murder. The real question now was who had been using his legitimate claim as perfect cover for their own deadly purposes, and the answer seemed to lie with someone who moved through St. Mary Mead with the invisibility of complete familiarity. Her contemplation was interrupted by Dr. Haydock's urgent arrival before 8 o'clock, his usual professional composure replaced by obvious alarm. "There's been another attempt," he announced without preamble. "Young Timmy Fletcher was taken violently ill during the night, the same symptoms as poor Millicent, though thankfully caught in time." Miss Marple set down her gardening shears with deliberate calm, though her pulse quickened. The boy who claimed to have seen Mrs. Weatherby walking with a gentleman. The very same. His mother found him retching violently, complaining of a bitter taste and difficulty breathing. The curious thing is, Timmy swears he only drank his usual bedtime cocoa, prepared as always by Edith Stone. She's been helping with the Fletcher children since Mrs. Fletcher's bout of influenza. The significance struck Miss Marple immediately. Edith Stone, the invisible companion housekeeper who smelled of carbolic soap and lavender, who had access to Mrs. Weatherby's house, papers, and correspondence, who could move through the village dispensing kindness and cocoa without arousing the slightest suspicion. "Doctor, the preparation of such precise doses, it would require considerable knowledge of the victim's constitution. Indeed, someone who knew both Mrs. Weatherby's approximate weight and young Timmy's smaller frame. The dosages were calculated quite deliberately, enough to kill in one case, merely to incapacitate in the other." Miss Marple's mind worked with quiet precision. The attempt on Timmy's life confirmed her growing suspicions while revealing the killer's desperation. The boy's testimony about the evening meeting had clearly posed a threat that needed silencing, but the poisoner had made a crucial error in timing and dosage. Her investigation of Edith Stone began with a visit to Mrs. Price Ridley, who proved a font of information about the village's domestic arrangements. "Such a treasure, that Edith," she confided over morning tea. "Been with poor Millicent for nearly 15 years, ever since she came down from London after some family trouble. Never speaks of her past, mind you, but then service people rarely do." The mention of family trouble intrigued Miss Marple considerably. "London, you say? I wonder what brought her to our quiet village." "Some scandal with her previous employer, I believe. Millicent was always one for taking in strays. Said Edith had excellent references, despite the circumstances." Miss Marple's next stop was the chemist's shop, where Mr. Petherick's garrulous nature proved invaluable. Among his recent sales to Edith Stone were items that painted a disturbing picture. Gum solution for securing dressings, which could easily be used to prepare poisoned sugar crystals, and a quantity of dried herbs that included several with medicinal properties. "Always so knowledgeable about preparations," Mr. Petherick observed admiringly. "Quite the little nurse she is. Says it comes from caring for her previous employer's invalid mother." The pieces were forming a clear pattern in Miss Marple's mind. Someone with medical knowledge, access to Mrs. Weatherby's correspondence, and the ability to move freely through the village. Someone who had discovered Mr. Asherton's legitimate claim to the Weatherby inheritance and seen an opportunity to eliminate both the threat to her own position and the inconvenient witness to her deception. That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged what appeared to be a casual encounter with Edith Stone near the village green. The woman approached with her usual composed efficiency, carrying her familiar medical bag and emanating that distinctive scent of carbolic and lavender. "My dear Edith," Miss Marple began conversationally, "I do hope young Timmy Fletcher is recovering well from his unfortunate illness." The response was immediate and telling. Edith's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on her bag's handle, and her voice carried a defensive note that had not been there in previous conversations. "Children will eat unsuitable things, Miss Marple. One can only do so much to protect them." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, noting the fine scratches at the base of Edith's thumb. Exactly the marks one might expect from gripping and breaking glass ampoules. Though I understand his symptoms were remarkably similar to poor Mrs. Weatherby's. Such an unfortunate coincidence. The silence that followed was profound. Edith Stone stood perfectly still, her composed mask beginning to show hairline cracks as the implications of Miss Marple's observation settled over them both. Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence. "I've been admiring that old wedding photograph on Mrs. Weatherby's mantelpiece. The bride bears such a striking resemblance to you, the same fine bone structure, the same elegant hands. Family connections can be so revealing, don't you think?" The transformation in Edith's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The woman who had moved through St. Mary Mead with perfect invisibility was finally being seen, and the weight of that scrutiny was becoming unbearable. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," Edith replied, but her voice had acquired a tremor that spoke volumes about the pressure building beneath her carefully maintained surface. As they parted company, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of family secrets and how they could fester in darkness until they poisoned everything they touched. The guest who had brought no shadow had indeed cast darkness over St. Mary Mead. But that shadow belonged not to him, but to someone whose presence had been so constant, so helpful, so utterly above suspicion that she had become invisible. The investigation was approaching its climax, though Miss Marple suspected that the final revelation would prove more shocking than anything the village had yet imagined. The truth, when it emerged, would show that the most dangerous predators were often those who moved among their prey with the perfect camouflage of devoted service and unquestioned trust. The morning following her pointed conversation with Edith Stone found Miss Marple contemplating the delicate art of psychological pressure while tending to her correspondence. The woman's trembling voice and defensive posture had confirmed her suspicions, but extracting a confession from someone who had maintained perfect invisibility for 15 years would require considerably more finesse than direct accusation. Her strategy began with a carefully worded note to Mrs. Bantry, suggesting that certain documents concerning the Weatherby inheritance had been discovered among Mrs. Weatherby's effects and were being held for safekeeping at the vicarage until the solicitor's arrival. Mrs. Bantry, with her gift for gentle gossip, would ensure this information reached precisely the ears that needed to hear it. By afternoon, Miss Marple had positioned herself in the vicarage drawing-room under the pretext of helping Mrs. Clement sort through the jumble linens returned from the fete. She noted with particular interest the sugar tongs laid out for polishing, including the pair Sally Brent had borrowed from the vestry collection, the very ones that bore those mysterious indentations. Inspector Slack, when she shared her suspicions, listened with the careful attention of a man who had learned to respect her insights, despite their unconventional source. "You're suggesting we set a trap, Miss Marple." "Not a trap, Inspector. Merely an invitation for someone to reveal their true nature. People who have convinced themselves they are indispensable rarely run when cornered. They stand quite still and look for a way to remain necessary." The evening brought the results Miss Marple had anticipated. As twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, she maintained her quiet vigil in the vicarage drawing-room, her knitting providing perfect cover for observation. The disturbance came just after 9 o'clock, a careful testing of the study window, followed by the soft scrape of someone entering with practiced stealth. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, as a familiar silhouette moved through the study with the economical precision she had observed in Edith Stone. The intruder's movements spoke of intimate knowledge of the house's layout, and that distinctive scent of carbolic and lavender confirmed her identity beyond doubt. The search was methodical but increasingly frantic as no documents materialized. When the old vestry bell gave an unexpected clatter in the night breeze, the intruder startled, catching her coat on a nail and dropping something small that clinked against the floor before retreating through the window. Miss Marple waited several minutes before investigating. She found a small corked bottle bearing the chemist's label for gum solution, its neck tacky with residue. On the window sill, a black thread clung to the nail, and in the soft earth below, a narrow footprint showed the distinctive wear pattern of someone who spent long hours on domestic duties. The following morning brought Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated tea gathering. She had invited Edith Stone under the pretext of discussing Mrs. Weatherby's household effects, while Inspector Slack waited discreetly in the vicar's study. The setting was deliberately domestic. Her own sitting room with its comfortable chairs and familiar china, the kind of environment where truth often emerged more easily than in formal interrogations. Edith arrived with her usual composed efficiency, but Miss Marple noted the subtle signs of strain that sleepless nights and growing pressure had etched around her eyes. Her medical bag remained close at hand, and she positioned herself near the door with the instinctive caution of someone sensing danger. Such a puzzling business, this inheritance matter. Miss Marple began conversationally, pouring tea with deliberate calm. Poor Mrs. Weatherby was so excited about her genealogical discoveries. She mentioned finding connections that would set certain people back on their heels. The teacup rattled almost imperceptibly in Edith's hands. Mrs. Weatherby was prone to flights of fancy, Miss Marple. These old family histories often prove disappointing. Indeed, though I understand she was particularly interested in the Weatherby family. Spelled with an A, not an E, like her own name. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm. And then there's that curious wedding photograph on her mantelpiece. The bride bears such a striking resemblance to you, my dear. The effect was immediate and profound. Edith's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her breath catching as the implications settled over her. The woman who had moved through St. Mary Mead with perfect invisibility was finally being seen, and the weight of that scrutiny was becoming unbearable. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Edith replied, but her voice had acquired a tremor that spoke of secrets under enormous pressure. Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence, each observation delivered with the inexorable patience of someone who had spent a lifetime studying human nature. She mentioned the borrowed sugar tongs with their mysterious indentations, the precise dosages that spoke of medical knowledge, the convenient timing of young Timmy's illness after his inconvenient testimony. With each revelation, Edith Stone's mask slipped further. The helpful companion housekeeper was dissolving before Miss Marple's eyes, revealing someone far more calculating and desperate beneath the surface of devoted service. "You've been managing more than Mrs. Weatherby's household, haven't you, my dear?" Miss Marple observed quietly. "The Weatherby inheritance has been quite substantial, I imagine. Enough to justify considerable risk." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with unspoken confessions and the weight of 15 years of careful deception finally approaching its end. Edith Stone sat frozen, her teacup trembling in hands that had administered poison with such clinical precision, while Miss Marple waited with the patient attention of someone who knew that the truth, once invited, rarely declined to appear. The guest who had brought no shadow was about to be revealed as the victim rather than the perpetrator, while the woman who had hidden in plain sight found herself finally, irrevocably, exposed to the harsh light of justice that had been so long in coming. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and Miss Marple could see the exact moment when Edith Stone's carefully constructed world began to tremble at its foundations. The woman who had maintained perfect invisibility for 15 years found herself finally, irrevocably seen, and the weight of that scrutiny was proving unbearable. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate calm and moved to her writing desk, withdrawing a small corked bottle that bore the chemist's label for gum solution. "You dropped this last night, my dear, when your coat caught on the vicarage nail. Such a distinctive scent it has. Quite unmistakable when one has learned to notice such details." Edith's teacup rattled against its saucer, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "Oh, but I think you do." Miss Marple returned to her chair, noting how Edith's hands had tightened until the knuckles showed white. "That wedding photograph on Mrs. Weatherby's mantelpiece, for instance. The bride bears such a striking resemblance to you, the same fine bone structure, the same elegant hands. But it's not Mrs. Weatherby in that photograph at all, is it? It's you, 30 years ago, when you were Margaret Asherton marrying James Weatherby." The effect was immediate and profound. Edith's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her breath catching as the implications settled over her like a shroud. The helpful companion housekeeper was dissolving before Miss Marple's eyes, revealing someone far more desperate beneath the surface of devoted service. "You cannot possibly understand," Edith whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. 15 years of servitude, of watching her live in comfort on what was rightfully mine." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm. "But it wasn't servitude at all, was it? You were managing your own inheritance, secretly administering the Weatherby estate through intermediaries while playing the grateful servant. Mrs. Weatherby never questioned where her remarkably successful investments came from, never wondered why her income was so substantial and reliable." The confession, when it came, poured forth with the desperate relief of someone who had carried an unbearable burden for far too long. Margaret Weatherby, for that was indeed her true name, had married James Weatherby in a private ceremony 30 years ago. When he died unexpectedly, his family had disputed the marriage's legitimacy, leaving her without legal recourse or financial resources. "I had nothing," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as the truth emerged. "No proof that would satisfy the lawyers, no money for legal battles. I took the name Edith Stone and sought employment as a companion. When I heard that a widow named Weatherby had settled in St. Mary Mead, I thought it might be Providence, a chance to hide in plain sight while I managed what was rightfully mine." Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding. "And it worked beautifully for 15 years. You controlled the estate, ensured Mrs. Weatherby's comfortable lifestyle, and maintained your invisibility. But then her genealogical research began to threaten everything. She was so thorough, so persistent. When she began corresponding with someone claiming to be a Weatherby heir, I realized she would eventually discover the truth about my marriage. She had already found church records, witness statements. It was only a matter of time before she connected Margaret Asherton to Margaret Weatherby." The irony was profound and terrible. Mrs. Weatherby had been unknowingly helping to establish the very claim that would have solved Margaret's problems while exposing her deception. "So you arranged to meet Mr. Asherton yourself that evening," Miss Marple observed, "disguised in Mrs. Weatherby's coat, with your hair arranged differently. Young Timmy saw you, though he thought it was Mrs. Weatherby herself." Margaret's laugh held no humor. The boy was too observant for his own good. "I examined Asherton's documents, realized his claim was legitimate, and saw an opportunity. I could eliminate the threats to my position while letting the village suspect the obvious outsider." Miss Marple's sharp mind pieced together the elaborate method. "You stole his heart medication during that meeting, those glass ampules containing alkaloids. Then you prepared your poison using the borrowed sugar tongs to crush the glass, mixing the extracted alkaloid with sugar crystals and coating Mrs. Weatherby's glass with gum solution to ensure adherence. The confusion with the wasp provided perfect cover," Margaret admitted with clinical detachment. "I had calculated the dosage precisely, knowing Mrs. Weatherby's constitution from years of observation. When the glasses were switched in the chaos, I thought I was safe. But you hadn't counted on Mr. Asherton's caution. A man with a heart condition learns to be particular about what touches his lips. He detected the faint stickiness and chose the other glass. Margaret's composure cracked again. Everything went wrong. Mrs. Weatherby died instead of him, creating exactly the kind of disturbance I'd hoped to avoid. And then the boy's testimony threatened to expose my evening meeting with Asherton. "So you tried to silence Timmy with his bedtime cocoa," Miss Marple said quietly. "But children's constitutions are unpredictable, and you miscalculated the dosage." The sound of footsteps in the hall made Margaret start violently, her gaze darting between the door and her medical bag. Miss Marple observed the small, betraying movement of her right hand as it slid toward the bag's clasp with desperate calculation. "Inspector Slack thought it safer that we all be together," Miss Marple mentioned conversationally. "One wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen in the lane." Margaret Weatherby sat frozen, her medical bag clutched, in hands that had administered both healing and death with equal precision. The woman who had hidden in plain sight for 15 years was finally stepping into the harsh light of justice that had been so long in coming. The guest who had brought no shadow was about to be revealed as the victim rather than the perpetrator, while the real killer prepared to face the consequences of a deception that had consumed 3 decades of her life. The masquerade was finally over, and Margaret Weatherby, companion, housekeeper, secret heiress, and murderer, waited with the terrible patience of someone who knew that all shadows, eventually, must fall. The footsteps in the hall belonged to Inspector Slack, who entered Miss Marple's sitting room with the measured precision of a man who understood he was witnessing the final act of a carefully orchestrated drama. Dr. Haydock followed quietly, positioning himself near the door with professional gravity, while the afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to cast everything in sharp relief. Margaret Weatherby, for she could no longer maintain the fiction of being Edith Stone, remained seated, her medical bag clutched in hands that had begun to tremble despite her efforts at composure. "Mrs. Weatherby," Inspector Slack said quietly, placing a sealed evidence bag containing the borrowed sugar tongs on Miss Marple's table. "I believe it's time we spoke plainly." The use of her real name seemed to shatter the last of Margaret's carefully maintained defenses. The woman who had hidden behind 15 years of devoted service finally allowed her mask to slip completely, revealing features marked by decades of suppressed bitterness and the terrible weight of maintaining an impossible deception. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm as she wove together the final threads of the mystery. "You see, my dear, you were extraordinarily clever in your planning. You understood that invisibility was your greatest weapon. Who would suspect the devoted, quiet housekeeper? You cultivated an air of being utterly unremarkable while manipulating lives and fortunes with surgical precision." Margaret's confession, when it came, poured forth with the desperate relief of someone who had carried an unbearable burden for far too long. The story that emerged was one of legitimate love corrupted by legal technicalities and social prejudice. A young woman's valid marriage transformed into a weapon of revenge by the cruelties of inheritance law. "James and I were married in a small church in Dorset during the war," Margaret began, her voice growing stronger as the truth finally found expression. "We thought we had years ahead of us to make our union more formal, more documented. But he died in France, and his family claimed our marriage was invalid. Insufficient witnesses, they said, a wartime romance with no legal standing." The legal battles had consumed what little money Margaret possessed, leaving her destitute and desperate. The transformation from Margaret Weatherby to Edith Stone had been born of necessity, but it had evolved into something far more calculating as the years passed. When I learned that a widow named Weatherby had settled in St. Mary Mead, it seemed like Providence itself. I could hide in plain sight while managing what was rightfully mine through intermediaries. She never questioned her remarkable good fortune with investments, never wondered why her income was so substantial and reliable. Inspector Slack leaned forward slightly. "But you weren't simply managing her affairs, were you? You were systematically redirecting the Weatherby estate income to yourself." I was taking what belonged to me by right of marriage. The words came out with surprising vehemence before Margaret caught herself. Every pound, every shilling was mine. I was simply ensuring it reached its proper destination. Miss Marple observed the transformation taking place before them. The helpful companion housekeeper was dissolving entirely, replaced by someone harder, more calculating, yet also profoundly wounded by decades of injustice. And when Mrs. Weatherby's genealogical research began to threaten your arrangement, Miss Marple prompted gently. Margaret's laugh held no humor. She was relentless in her thoroughness. Her correspondence with that Asherton person would have eventually exposed everything. She had already found church records, witness statements. It was only a matter of time before she connected Margaret Asherton to Margaret Weatherby and realized her devoted companion was actually the rightful heir to the fortune she thought was hers. The method of murder, when Margaret described it with clinical detachment, revealed a mind that had spent years planning for every contingency. She had stolen Mr. Asherton's heart medication during their evening meeting, extracting the alkaloid from the glass ampules using the borrowed sugar tongs. The precision required had left those telltale indentations Miss Marple had noticed. I knew Mrs. Weatherby's constitution intimately after 15 years of observation, Margaret explained. The alkaloid required precise calculation, mixed with sugar crystals and applied to her glass, using gum solution to ensure adherence. The confusion with the wasp provided perfect cover for switching the glasses. But Mr. Asherton was cautious about what touched his lips, Dr. Haydock observed quietly. A man with a heart condition learns such habits, Margaret replied with bitter disappointment. He detected the faint stickiness and chose the other glass. Everything went wrong. Mrs. Weatherby died instead of him, creating exactly the kind of disturbance I had hoped to avoid. The attempt on young Timmy's life had been born of desperation rather than calculation, a mistake that had ultimately led to her exposure. Miss Marple noted how Margaret's hands shook more violently as the full weight of her situation became clear. Inspector Slack rose with quiet authority. Margaret Weatherby, I arrest you for the murder of Millicent Weatherby and the attempted murder of Timothy Fletcher. As Margaret reached instinctively for her medical bag, Inspector Slack's hand covered hers with gentle but implacable firmness. I think we've had quite enough of that sort of solution. Margaret Weatherby looked around Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room one final time, taking in the familiar china, the gentle afternoon light, the peaceful domesticity that had been both her refuge and her prison. When she spoke again, her voice carried the terrible clarity of someone who had finally reached the end of a very long road. 30 years of fighting for what was mine, she said simply. 15 years of pretending to be grateful for my own charity. I suppose it's finished now. As Margaret was led away with the dignity she maintained even in defeat, the room seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding. The scent of carbolic and lavender, once a subtle, reassuring presence, now lingered like a ghostly accusation. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead struggled to comprehend how they had lived so comfortably with a killer in their midst. The village's initial relief at having found their obvious suspect gave way to a more unsettling truth, that the most dangerous shadows were often cast by those whose presence was so constant as to be invisible. Mr. Asherton, when he came to thank Miss Marple, looked less haunted, the shadow of suspicion finally lifted from him. I cannot decide, he said quietly, whether I have gained a mother or lost one. Miss Marple's reply was characteristically gentle. Perhaps neither, Mr. Asherton. Perhaps you have simply discovered the shape of a shadow that has always lain across your life. One cannot choose the direction of such shadows, only whether to step out of them. The guest who had brought no shadow was free to reclaim his true inheritance, while the woman who had hidden in plain sight for 15 years stepped finally into the harsh light of justice that had been so long in coming. Miss Marple returned to her knitting and her roses, reflecting that human nature, like any garden, kept its record in the smallest details, In the angle of a footprint in soft soil, in a thread caught on a nail, in the faintest scent of carbolic where lavender pretended to reign. The mystery was solved, but its lessons about the dangerous depths that could lie beneath the most ordinary surfaces would linger in St. Mary Mead for years to come. The weeks following Margaret Weatherby's arrest settled over St. Mary Mead like a gentle convalescence, the village slowly recovering from the profound shock of discovering that their most trusted neighbor had been their most dangerous resident. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries with casual confidence now found themselves studying familiar faces with new uncertainty, wondering what other secrets might lie hidden beneath the surface of their peaceful community. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the staggering extent of Margaret's deception. For 15 years, she had systematically redirected the substantial Weatherby estate income through a network of intermediaries, ensuring Mrs. Weatherby's comfortable lifestyle while secretly reclaiming what she considered her rightful inheritance. The irony was profound and terrible. Mrs. Weatherby had unknowingly lived on the charity of the woman she believed was dependent on hers, while her genealogical research had been inadvertently working to establish the very claim that would have legitimized Margaret's position. Mr. Giles Asherton, now free to reclaim his true identity as Giles Weatherby, proved to be a man of unexpected generosity and grace. When the estate's complexities were finally untangled by the solicitors, he ensured that Mrs. Weatherby's genuine heirs received appropriate compensation, while establishing a trust to support village charitable works in her memory. The guest who had brought no shadow had indeed cast light into the darker corners of inheritance law and human nature. "I cannot adequately express my gratitude, Miss Marple," he said during his final visit to her cottage. His bearing transformed from the hunted wariness of their first meeting to something approaching peace. "You saw through my necessary deceptions, but more importantly, you saw through hers. You saved me from false accusation and restored my family's honor." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm. "Human nature, Mr. Weatherby, is rather like a garden. It keeps its own records in the smallest details. One simply needs to know where to look for the signs of what grows beneath the surface." The village's recovery was thorough but permanently changed. Mrs. Bantry, initially rendered speechless by the revelation that dear Edith had been a calculating killer, gradually regained her capacity for pronouncement, though her observations now carried a sharper edge of caution. The annual fete, when it was held the following summer, proceeded without incident, though Miss Marple noted that the tea service received considerably more scrutiny than in previous years. Young Timmy Fletcher, fully recovered from his brush with death, had become something of a village celebrity for his observational skills. His innocent comment about the guest who brought no shadow had proved more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. The boy's natural curiosity, once merely charming, was now viewed with new respect by adults who had learned the value of paying attention to details others might dismiss. Dr. Haydock, reviewing the case with Miss Marple over afternoon tea, marveled at the psychological complexity of the crime. 30 years of legitimate grievance twisted into 15 years of elaborate revenge, he observed. She was, simultaneously, the most patient and the most desperate killer I've encountered. Miss Marple considered this thoughtfully. "I believe, Doctor, that Margaret Weatherby was neither truly patient nor desperate, but rather someone who had convinced herself that justice delayed was justice denied. She had lived so long with her sense of being wronged that she could no longer distinguish between rectifying an injustice and committing one. As autumn approached and the leaves began their annual transformation, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious mathematics of human nature that had turned love into obsession, legitimate claim into murderous deception, and devoted service into the perfect disguise for revenge. The case had reminded her once again that the most dangerous predators were often those who moved among their prey with the perfect camouflage of unquestioned trust and helpful competence. The scent of her roses, now in their final bloom, drifted through her garden as evening shadows lengthened across the peaceful village. Each shadow fell precisely where it belonged, properly attached to its owner, and Miss Marple found considerable comfort in such natural order after the artificial complexities of the case that had so recently disturbed their tranquillity. Margaret Weatherby's tragedy, she reflected, lay not in her original circumstances, which might have been resolved through patience and proper legal channels, but in her decision that deception was preferable to truth, that elaborate revenge was more satisfying than honest justice. The woman who had hidden in plain sight for 15 years had finally stepped into the harsh light she had so long deserved, while the man who had truly brought no shadow had learned at last to cast his own. The mystery was solved, justice served, and St. Mary Mead had returned to its gentle rhythms, though with a new awareness that even the most familiar faces might conceal the most dangerous secrets. Miss Marple gathered her knitting as the first stars appeared, content in the knowledge that while human nature might never change, the careful observer could ensure that its darker impulses did not go entirely unnoticed in the shadows they inevitably cast.